Creating characters that follow the 3 R's of characterization is the most important skill that a writer can master. If your characters aren't round, relatable, and realistic, your story is likely to fall flat. But luckily, you can strategically plan out your characters, their traits, the role that they play in the story, to help create a cohesive cast of characters that your readers will latch onto. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a short story writer who holds a bachelor's degree in creative writing. I teach the foundations of creative fiction writing to writers who are either just starting out or ready to get published or somewhere in between. I'm bringing my teaching practice online to you and others just like you that are ready to take their writing careers to the next level so that you don't have to sit through 4 years of school and go into student debt just to be able to write a decent story. In this video, we're going to go over a few terms about characterization. We're going to talk about terms that can help us build up our characters and some that define the roles that our characters play in our stories. And here's a list of the terms that we're going to be going over. All of the definitions I'll use on screen are from literaryterms.net. Our first term is characterization. Characterization is a writer's tool or literary device that occurs anytime the author uses details to teach us about a person. We already established that characterization is the most important thing that a writer can do, and remember, your characters need to be round, relatable, and realistic, and you use characterization to make this happen. To dive deeper into characterization, I've got a few resources in the description of this video, including a link to my training on effective character profile use. It teaches you how to take the information in a character profile and build a big character out of it. Next, you'll need to know the term protagonist. The story circles around this character's experiences, and the audience is invited to see the world from their perspective. The protagonist is also often referred to as your main character. That's who your readers are rooting for as they go. They want to see this person succeed and change and grow. In opposition to the protagonist, we have the antagonist. In a story, the antagonist is the opposite of the protagonist or main character. Typically, this is a villain of some kind or someone who gets in their way. The antagonist is typically there to set up roadblocks for your protagonist. If your protagonist got everything that they wanted just like that, it would be a pretty boring story. The antagonist is there to, well, antagonize your protagonist. They can help you bring tension and drama into your story. Now let's look at the term archetype. It's any story element that appears again and again in stories from cultures around the world and symbolizes something universal in the human experience. In terms of characters, we see archetypes go back all the way to the beginning of storytelling. The hero, the villain, the joker, the everyman. As humans, we love to categorize things, including people. You could probably look around your family, your friends, and pick out who the funny one is, who the one is there to fix things, the one that's always breaking up fights. We all have our own mini archetypes within our lives. In your writing, you can use archetypes to help tell your story. Maybe your protagonist is the hero and they have a sidekick, joker, best friend who's always there to relieve the tension or gets them into harmless hijinks. And using these archetypes can help kind of keep characters in their own lane, especially if you have a large cast of characters. That way your reader can kind of rely on those archetype characters to act a certain way and they won't get things mixed up between characters. You can also use these archetypes to help you develop characters. If you have a hero's journey planned out for your character, then you might want to do some research on that hero archetype to make sure that your character fits that expectation that the hero's journey brings on to a reader. And you can customize the plot and the character traits and all of those kinds of things to make your story feel like yours and not just some cookie cutter hero going on a hero's journey. Next, let's look at the term stereotype. Stereotyping is assuming that they are all alike. It's looking at a whole group of people and assuming that they all share certain qualities. This is probably the term that most people are familiar with outside of writing, but we want to look at it from a writer's context as well. We all know stereotypes about different races, different genders, or sexualities. You've probably heard the stereotypes that all gay men are flamboyant or that women can't drive. Personally, I am a great driver. So that's the thing, right? Is that stereotypes just aren't true across the board. You just can't categorize such a large group of people into something so specific like that. It's important as writers to acknowledge those stereotypes in our writing and fix them. If your character is a token Asian student who's really good at math and he's studying to become a doctor, that's kind of a stereotype these days. It's 2023 as I'm recording this, so we all know it's time to move on from stereotypes. I think that we used to say that you could do stereotypes in your writing if you at least gave some kind of context for them, if you gave other character traits to your character as well. But unless you have a really good reason for it, maybe it's satire or you're trying to break the mold somehow, then I would really advise from staying away from stereotypes as much as possible. As writers, we often use what we call sensitivity readers to read our work before it goes out for publishing. writing to look for that kind of stuff, to look for things that might be offensive to some cultures that we're not a part of as the writer. So you can really rely on your community to help you fix those stereotypes if you do find them in your writing. And not only can it be offensive if stereotypes are done poorly, but frankly, it's just boring. We don't want to read another story about the same exact character over and over from different writers. Some stereotypes are pretty small in the grand scheme of things. For example, the stereotype that women can't drive. There are bad women drivers out there. We all know that. So it's okay for you to use that in your character as long as that's not repeatedly brought up, pointed out, and the main character trait that we see of her. You have to make sure that your character is well-rounded and balanced, and if she's a bad driver, she's a bad driver, but that cannot be her defining character trait. Other stereotypes can be really offensive and damaging to some communities. For example, if you had a cast of Black characters that were all thugs and gangsters and constantly getting in trouble with the police, that can be really damaging to Black communities. It's important to understand the complexities of the characters that you're writing and the communities and the backgrounds that they come from, and then show us those complexities. And again, if you need help with this, if you do want to write a story about somebody from a different background than you, you can ask people to help you out with that. You can reach out to those communities, you can reach out to people who might have lived those experiences and ask them if your writing makes sense or if they find it offensive. And if they find it offensive, it's your job to fix that and not be upset about that. So what's the difference though between a stereotype and an archetype? How do we know when we're crossing those lines? Well, I would say an archetype is broad. Take the jock and nerd dynamic, for example. If you stop there, those are archetypes. We have jocks and nerds all over Western culture in all of our media or literature. If you make the jock a meathead who's flunking out of school and is only dating the hot blonde cheerleader, well, that's kind of leaning towards stereotyping, right? And if your nerd is socially awkward and talks with a lisp, that's also leaning into stereotyping. Instead, maybe your jock loves art, and maybe your nerd is the popular kid at school. And again, there are ways to use archetypes without leaning into stereotyping. Just remember that stereotyping is something that we do not want to see in our writing moving forward. Next, let's look at round characters. These characters have many different traits, good and bad, making them more interesting. Your roundest characters need to be your main characters. A main character has to be round, realistic, and relatable. You'll hear me say that 1,000 times throughout these videos. They often have good intentions, but make mistakes. They might have ideas or prejudices about the world that aren't always moral, but these bigger negative traits are probably what's going to bring about that emotional shift in your character. Some smaller negative traits that you can give your character, but keep them likable, might be procrastination, or they're flunking out of school. Maybe they're unathletic, but they keep finding themselves in situations where that's their downfall. Basically, your round characters are not perfect. We see their flaws and we see why they think the way that they do. Even if your character has an arc that makes them a better person by the end of your story, they're still going to be flawed. We don't learn 1 or 2 lessons and become completely moral people, so your character is not going to be this almighty person by the end of the story either. Okay, so those are a few terms that will help you build those round, realistic, and relatable characters, but let's move into some terms that will kind of help you decide what roles your characters are going to play. Let's start with foils. A foil is a character that has the opposite character traits from another, meant to help highlight or bring out another's positive or negative side. Take these archetypal foils, for example. The superhero and the supervillain, the princess and the evil queen, the nerd and the jock. We often see characters with positive qualities and their foil has negative qualities. This is often done between the protagonist and the antagonist. This can be a great way to highlight something about one of your characters. For example, if your protagonist is known for stopping and watching the birds fly by, maybe you have another character who's scared of birds and shoos them away from the table. You'll want to make sure not to make this too in your face. This can be a great tool to use to highlight different qualities of your characters, but you just don't want to make it so obvious. For example, it would be pretty overboard to say that your character who's nice to everybody is blonde with blue eyes and wears pink all the time, and your character who is a bit more reclusive has brown hair, brown eyes, and wears black all the time. You have a light bubbly aesthetic and more of a dark aesthetic there, but that matches their personalities. But it's kind of cheesy, it's kind of overdone, and honestly, brunettes with brown eyes are not all reclusive. The bird example is nice because it's really subtle and it's things that would actually happen in the real world. They're different enough they stand out, but it's not so out of place in your story. Next, let's look at static characters. Characters who are static do not change throughout the story. The change that we're talking about with static characters is an emotional change. We're looking at the character arc here. If your character doesn't learn something new or change or grow as a person during your story, then they're a static character. Static characters usually aren't your main character. We like to see our main characters change and grow. But you can use static characters in your writing. For example, think of any John Green novel. These YA novels that focus in on teenagers usually have static parents. parents. The parent is there because teenagers need their parents. That's a really big part of their life. And so that's realistic for their parents to be there. But we're not spending so much time on the parents developing them as characters because they're not the focus of our story. Oftentimes in YA novels, parents get used as plot devices more than anything. This is a great way to use static characters in your writing. Next, we have dynamic characters. Dynamic characters change throughout the story. As the opposite of static characters, dynamic characters are the ones that change and grow throughout the story. They give us something to watch and something to invest in, and a reason to follow this character through the end of the story. Your character will learn and grow from their mistakes and become somebody a little bit different by the end of the story. And again, this is usually seen as an emotional shift. Maybe the cold-hearted villain survives and learns to love again. The wife asks for a divorce and is finally happy single. Some lesson is learned or some experience had that sparks a new lifestyle in your character. The whole story is building towards this change. That's why we're still reading. Next, let's look at flat characters. A flat character has one or two main traits, usually only all positive or all negative. This is a character that cannot effectively be your main character. It's okay to utilize flat characters in fiction, but I would stay away from using them as your main characters. Going back to that parent-teenager dynamic, these parents can be pretty flat characters if you wanted them to be. They can be the strict parents that are always stopping your teenager protagonist from going out and having fun or solving that mystery, or they're the pushovers who let the teenager do anything that they want. The key here is that they're that way the whole story. They don't flip-flop, they don't grow, they don't learn from anything. They just kind of are there the whole story. A lot of villains tend to be flat characters as well, especially super villains, because all they care about is death and destruction, and usually they die before they can learn anything. Personally, I find this quite boring, and I think if you give your villain a character arc, that your story is going to be 20 times better, a lot more interesting, and it's going to stand out from what's already out there. With all of these new writing terms in your toolbox, I want you to pick a couple of terms and write a character based off of them. And I want you to share that portrait with us down in the comments below. I would love to see them. If you have any questions about character types, be sure to leave a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I can about that. If you're interested in more ways to build characters, I do have a free training linked below that you can sign up for, and it'll go over how to effectively use a character profile so that it lifts up not only your characters, but the story that you're writing as well. So be sure to check that out and other resources on my website. And it'd be great if you subscribed and liked this video to help me reach more people who are in the same position as you. Well, I'll see you next time, and until then, happy writing.